to both have the initial discussions but also continue the discussion. So as Margareta and Nick, I'm sure, will say, this discussion will be recorded and posted in our Facebook group, and we hope that the discussion will continue there. Some of the speakers that we have had so far include Francesca Bertolini, who talked about Gamerteca and scenario-based games. We will hear soon from Julian Stodd, who's the founder of Seesaw Consulting around social learning and scaffolded social learning. We will also hear about sustainable action research and organizational learning. We will also talk about learning technology architecture and so on. Today we are lucky enough to have Nick Shackleton Jones, who joins us from PA Consulting. He's the Director of Learning and Performance Innovation. I hope I got that right, Nick. And we look forward very much to hearing from you, and also thank you and Charlie very much for all your support to date with the WhatsApp group talks that we have hosted. And we're really excited to hear from you about different elements of learning, agile learning, user-centered design, and so on. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to you, and very much look forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
That's wonderful. So yes, welcome to everybody who's joined the call. Thank you so much, and good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. As Fred says, Charlie and I have been working for some months now to support Fred in the ambition to build the conversation, I guess, around learning and innovation and new directions. And we've really enjoyed that, and I think we've learned a lot as well in hearing about your organization. And so I hope today that I'll hear more from you. I won't just be presenting, I'll also be asking you to contribute and to answer some questions. And so we'll pause, and please use the chat box as we go. The chat box will enable you to participate. So as Fred says, I'm Director of Learning Performance Innovation at PA Consulting. Prior to that, I worked for BP for 5 years, and I also worked for the BBC in London. And I started my life as a psychology lecturer. So my interest has always been in people and how we can support people better with learning. But before I talk more about our approach, I'll talk a bit about user-centered design, as you can see on the slide. And then at the end, I'll talk more about how we do more with less budget. Before we talk about those things, I'd like to know a bit more about you. And so the first question I have is, where are you from in the world? It'd be great to know which part of the world you're currently in. And as I say, if you use the chat box to type your answer, we'll be able to see what kind of spread of participants we have. London? Charlie says London. Hi, Daniela. Zurich, Switzerland. Hi, Sudeep, Nepal. Wow. Switzerland, France, Iran, India. Hi, Babak. Hi, Akash. Hi, Francis. Nigeria. Piotr from Poland. Hi, Piotr. Ekaterini, Cyprus, Thomas, Hackney. Michael, Melbourne. Wow, it's late in Melbourne, I guess. So yeah, thanks for staying up. Hi, Anna from Sweden. Hi, Nicole from Swansea. I know Swansea quite well. Half of my family are from Wales, so I go there often. Hi, Widya. Hi, Sonia from Romania. Fantastic. So that's amazing. We have people from all around the world. Wonderful. So now I have another question for you, a little more complex. What would you like to get from this session? Obviously, I have some pre-prepared stuff, but I can change, to some extent what we talk about. So what sorts of things would you like to learn more about, or would you like to know more about in the area of performance, learning performance innovation, or any aspect of learning, really? Again, if you can use the chat box. Hi, Raminda. Tight budget, yeah. What's going on in the world of innovation? Yeah. How to influence attitudes and behaviors? Great question, Michael. Current best practice, what mistakes to avoid? Yeah. Emotional aspects of learning. Fantastic. Thanks, Sonia. Sharing from others? Yeah. How do we make learning more accessible? Fantastic. Using technology in war zones. How to capture learning in the world of innovation and how to share it. Yeah. How to keep the passion in learning through the course. Fantastic. User-centered design. Brilliant. More effective tools. Yep. Hi, Akash. Health and industrial safety. Obviously, safety was a big question for BP, so we have a lot of experience. Not necessarily in the same kind of environments, but with similar topics. Yeah. Great. Okay. So I'll bear those questions in mind as I talk through this, and learning to cope with people. Yeah, that's for sure. So let me start with a slightly provocative position, which is we often talk to the people that we work with about not just thinking about learning, but thinking about learning elimination. Let me explain what I mean by learning elimination. Many organizations, just like yours, have people who are joining and leaving all the time. They may not stay very long with the organization, or they may go into an environment where they need to be effective very quickly. And this is a challenge for all kinds of organizations. And if it takes somebody weeks or months or several months to actually learn how to do a job effectively, then that's a huge problem. And so what we try and encourage people to think about is how can you make the organization more usable? And what we mean by that is if you're looking at this red line here on the graph, if you send somebody on a course and they go to a classroom and it takes 4 or 5 days of their time and they only remember 4 or 5 things, then you can achieve the same outcome, the same shift in performance with a dramatic reduction of cost and time if you can deliver those 4 or 5 things at the point at which they need them, for example, on a mobile device. That's really one of the critical things I want to say today. It underpins a lot of our work, which is if you get the support to people when and where they need it, exactly the right information, then it's a much more cost-effective way of achieving the same outcome. And of course, we're all familiar with this with Google. Many of us will use Google all the time to get what we need when we need it. And yet, we don't necessarily apply the same thinking at work. If you're interested in the theoretical research behind this approach, there's a book by Atul Gawande called The Checklist Manifesto. And if there is one book that I can highly recommend you read, it's Atul Gawande's book called The Checklist Manifesto. That will tell you an awful lot about improving effectiveness at reduced cost. So really with the learning elimination, what we're thinking about is how do you make your organization more usable? How do you make it easy for anybody to do a job very quickly? Now, sometimes people challenge me on this and say, maybe you're talking about making the learning smaller chunks, breaking things down into smaller pieces, not eliminating it. But actually, here's a really good example of learning elimination. This was my first computer. As you can see, it came with 2 quite hefty manuals, and you had to read and learn all of those codes before you could get the computer to do anything very useful. But of course, today, we have computers like this. And famously, there is no manual, and you can use it as soon as you take it out of the box. And so I would like to challenge you to think about your organization in the same way. When somebody joins, does it take them weeks or months to understand all the standard operating procedures and manuals and learning, or can they immediately be effective? And how would we do that if we wanted to make people immediately effective? I don't think it is as hard as some people imagine, because I believe that we're starting to do this in our everyday lives all the time. So have a look at these questions. And again, I'd be grateful if you can use the chat box. How would you do these things? Find your way in a strange city, help your daughter with her homework, find a restaurant in a new area. How would you do these kinds of things today? So please type your answers into the chat box. Google, that's it, yeah, Google, YouTube, yeah. I knew the guy who was responsible for learning at Google, a guy called Sudhir Giri, and years ago when they first acquired YouTube, he said he spent the whole night trying to find something that he couldn't learn on YouTube, and he couldn't find anything that he couldn't learn on YouTube. So yeah, Google, YouTube, Internet. Sometimes, for example, recommendations. So you might use a social recommendation engine like IMDb, Internet Movie Database, if it's a film, or you might use TripAdvisor, I guess. But yeah, Google and YouTube are the basic. I asked this question many times from many different audiences, and two responses that I never hear people say are classroom and e-learning. And that, I think, is very interesting because it highlights a problem, which is that the way that we learn and get things done every day no longer resembles the tools that we're using within our organizations. And what's the problem with these formats? Well, people like Classroom, but by and large it's ineffective in the sense that a lot of the information that you try and push into a classroom is lost. And we've all known this. And of course it's very costly, to your point around cost effectiveness. So many organizations have looked to e-learning instead because it's cheaper. But the problem is that people often don't like e-learning very much, and it can also be quite ineffective. So I'm going to talk about how we make use of a classroom setting and digital learning in a more effective way. And so this is what we recommend. Instead of doing classroom and e-learning, experiences and resources. What do I mean by experiences? Well, many of us will have had great learning experiences when we go to a classroom. But if you ask people about what they remember from those classroom sessions, it will be the experiences. It will be networking. They'll say, we had some fun, we did an activity. And so these things are great. If you're getting people together in a classroom, make it an experience. And what we mean by an experience is a challenging situation, a simulation of real work. Get people together and give them a chance to practice. They also love increasingly to get badges or certificates or something which they can take forwards as evidence of their capability, of their mastery. So building experiences when you're going to pay, and often it is expensive to get people together, but building experiences is a much better way to make use of that classroom time. And secondly, and I'll talk a lot more about this, resources. All of us are used to the idea now that we can use Google and YouTube whenever we need it to get what we need. And we can do the same for our organizations. The problem, of course, with Google and YouTube is the stuff that you need to work in your organization isn't on Google or YouTube. There's lots of other stuff, how to bake, how to garden, but the specific content for your organization isn't there. So this becomes our job, to give people that kind of resource that they need to get the job done within the organization. So a lot of our work for different organizations is about designing these resources around the everyday tasks and challenges that they have. And this is where, if you're wondering, the user centricity comes in. Because how can you design these things if you don't really know what challenges people have? So I'm going to start then asking you some questions about these challenges. Firstly, what are some of the things that your audience, your learners, really care about? What are the things which are driving their learning? I think, Sonia, you asked about the emotional aspect, and I think that's a really good question because it's often our emotions which drive our learning. If we want to if we're ashamed to look incompetent, or we're afraid of making a mistake, these kinds of emotions drive our learning. So the first critical thing is to understand what the audience really care about. So please use the chat box and let us know what are some of the things that your learners really care about. Yeah, Nicole, knowing how to do the job. You know, that's a really good answer. And it's borne out by quite a lot of research, the Towards Maturity research done here in the UK, that people's learning primarily is because they want to do the job better. People really care about doing the job well. Credibility, yeah, really important. Having a negative effect on other people, yeah, people want to avoid making mistakes or having a negative effect on friends or family. Social skills, self-awareness, creative thinking, yeah. Visibility, yes. People's reputation is also very important. Akash says, do you think organizational media is the next big thing, social media for learning? We do see a lot of that, and we have implemented lots of social media for learning. And I think that we as learning professionals have a really important role to play in creating and supporting those environments. Best practice, Michael, thank you. Yep, absolutely. People want to know what's the best way to do something. Return on investment. Yep, absolutely. Feelings of inadequacy. Yeah, you're right, Sonia. Those feelings that you don't know or you're not good enough can drive learning. Yeah, reaching more people and doing a better job. Thank you. That's a great set. So another question then. What are some of the tasks that they are having to do regularly? So I've understood a little bit about some of the concerns. What are some of the things that they're having to do on a regular basis? Again, if you can use the chat box, that would be great. Working under pressure, yeah. Training others, supporting others, yeah. Representing others, yeah. Okay, anything else? Any other sorts of tasks that your learners dealing with new entrants? Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Akash. Summarizing induction, that's a really good one. I'm glad you mentioned induction. Both Akash and Nicole dealing with new people and inducting new people, that's really a critical part of building performance. Supporting other colleagues, yeah. Inducing a new person. Tracing family, how to stay safe, yeah. Great. Okay. One more question, and then I'll move on. And what are some of the things that you would like your teams to care more about? So this is a different question. It's not what they currently care about. It's not the job that they're having to do today. But like many organizations, there will be initiatives that it might be safety, for example, or data protection, where they want learners and audiences to care more about these areas. So what are the things where you would like your audiences to care more? Accountability and quality, great. Quality. Diplomacy, thanks, Michael. Supporting others to learn and develop, yeah. Yeah, not doing that which is not intended to be done, so sort of, I guess, not making mistakes, doing the wrong things. Quality, empathy, the joy of learning, yeah, yeah. Their role in creating change. Thanks, Dorcas. Okay, great. So, trying to keep positive, yep, sort of emotional resilience, quality and effectiveness. Fundamental principles. Thanks, Hannah. Great. So this already gives you a flavor of reaching targets. Thanks, Akash. A flavor of the kinds of questions that we use in user-centered learning design. And this is already a very different approach, because usually, and I've been working in learning for about 25 years, I guess, usually it starts with some content that everybody has to know. And we all recognize that transaction. Somebody says, here's a manual, here's an operating procedure, here's some new guidelines, build a module or build a course. But what's different, what we do which is different, is we say, okay, but before we build a course, we will go and we will talk to people about how they think we could achieve this, what they are struggling with day to day. And often what we find is that what they need is an experience or a resource, a chance to practice, for example, or to talk to somebody knowledgeable, or a resource that they can use when they encounter this problem. So let me show you how this works in practice. When we talk to people, we find there are things that they don't care enough about. They may not care enough about quality, for example. But there are also things which they care very much about. They may care very much about doing a good job, or they may care about not making a mistake. And what we find is that where people really care about something, the best thing to build is a resource or a guide. In the same way that if you Google something, you don't necessarily want a whole module or a course. You just want the answer, and you don't really care if it's just text, because you are pulling that information. And what makes you pull it is your concern. You're looking for support and guidance and simple practical stuff. A good example would be induction. When people join an organization, they really don't want to look ridiculous. They really don't want to make mistakes. So simple guidance, checklists, these are the things you should do. These are the top 10 mistakes that people make. Those can be very, very effective. But often we find that organizations want people to care about things that they don't. Quality, for example. And there, an experience is much more impactful. Giving people a first-hand way of experiencing the importance of something, whether it's safety or something like that. That could be a scenario, sometimes it can be a story, sometimes it can be hearing from somebody firsthand. That was certainly the way that we tackled people's care about safety in BP, getting people to understand the personal impact of mistakes was a very effective approach. So how do you do this in practice? We have a process. Some of you may be familiar with ADDIE, which is analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. It's a kind of a standard process. The problem with ADDIE is that at no stage are you required to talk to your users. So it's not, I would say, user-centered. So instead, we do this. We define what the organization wants to achieve. We then talk to people in a similar way that I asked questions earlier about what their concerns are. We ask them, what's really driving your behavior? What is it that you're worried about every day? What are the tasks that you're having to do? And then we design resources or experiences typically based on what we know people are really concerned about, and we use that to decide how we can achieve the outcomes we've defined at the first stage. We then develop. We typically try to deploy something very quickly that's a test, and then we iterate to improve. This is quite a low-cost way of doing things for two reasons. Often these resources are a lot cheaper to develop than, say, classroom training or e-learning or modules. And also because we like to develop a prototype, something which is just a very quick test of the approach, and then we get feedback. So we don't take too long, and we don't spend too much money. We develop something that people can use very quickly, and then they tell us if it's useful or not. So that saves a lot of money as well. So I'll talk about a couple of these different kinds of things and show you some examples. I always think it's better if you can see some examples. So with experiences, it sounds like other people are going to be talking about, say, simulation or scenarios or storytelling. We use all of these formats to build really powerful experiences. I think often an experience is most powerful when you get together in a real location, in a workshop, say. But you can also build digital experiences. If you hear a really powerful story, that can be an experience which stays with you a long time. And the other thing that we have done a lot of is building resources. Resources are typically videos, animations, checklists, infographics, these kinds of things. The resources you can see on your screen are some of the resources we built for BP around the challenge of being more inclusive as a learning environment. So some were quite costly to develop. For example, this animation you can see in the middle. But others were a lot cheaper to develop. So many of these videos you can see on the right were just people talking and sharing their experience. This is something that you can film on an iPhone, for example, and you can do very quickly. These graphics that you can see to the right are very useful for people. They give people simple guidance that they can print off, even if they don't have access to the internet. And you can use tools like PowerPoint, as we'll see later, to develop a lot of these graphics very quickly. So let me show you some examples. A couple of you talked about induction. We have exactly the same problem when I worked at BP. We had about 6,000 people joining the organization every year. It's a global organization, people in lots of operating environments. And when I joined BP, there were 8 hours of e-learning modules. And when I looked at the data, only 300 people had ever completed them. And these modules contain things like the history of our organization, our strategy, and so on. What they didn't tell you is stuff that you really wanted to know when you joined. So what we did to make it user-centered is we got together groups of new starters, people who'd recently joined, and we asked them, what were the things you found helpful? What were the things you worried about when you joined? What were the really difficult things? And very quickly they gave us a picture of what they cared about, what the tasks they were trying to do were, and we built resources which helped them with those things. So for example, they didn't want to look stupid or make a mistake, so we interviewed other new starters and we just got them to give some advice, simple advice. Do this, don't do this. Maybe think about doing this. My advice would be this. And people love to watch those videos. Not formal CEO type scripted videos, just informal, friendly advice from other colleagues. The other thing that we built was lots of fact sheets that gave everybody the information that they needed and a checklist. One of the most popular parts of the site was a checklist. This site went live, and after 4 years we had 1 million visits. It was the most popular site anywhere in the organization because it gave people kind of helpful stuff. And so it's actually quite easy to make this shift from conventional learning to innovative, helpful content. Martin's asked, how do you protect the quality? Well, if the video is helpful, the quality is not so much of an issue. What I mean by that is if you go on YouTube, quite often you just want the answer. So whether or not it's a high quality video or not is not really the biggest concern that you have. The concern is whether or not it actually helps you. I think, Martin, maybe your question was more around how do you prevent inaccurate advice? Yeah, I can see inaccurate advice. And I'll come back to that because it's a really good question. In answer to your question, Martin, this was another big project we undertook. Like many organizations, people have knowledge around the world, but sharing that knowledge is really difficult. On the left-hand side of this picture, you can see people are documenting things. You sometimes have to speak to the expert. Knowledge is only captured infrequently. Quite often it's very topic-centered and very dense. So we shifted an organization to the right-hand side where it's easy to capture and share knowledge. It's an everyday activity. It's very much more task-centered, and you can access it at the point that you need it. So let me show you an example of that. This was a site that we created within BP, and it had about 3,000 short video clips. So it was like a BP YouTube. And any question that you had about technical challenges or sometimes kind of softer skills challenges like resilience or people telling stories, you could find that content on the hub. And in answer to your question, Martin, initially there was a lot of anxiety about the quality of this information. But what we did on this site was we enable people to self-moderate. So anybody could contribute content. It would go through a short period where somebody would review it. But if anybody felt that the information was inaccurate, then you could flag that as an issue. You could say, look, there's a problem with this video, and we would go back and review it. So rather than having just a central authority producing content, everybody was entitled to produce content, and it was constantly reviewed by the community as well as by the experts. And this answers, I think, some of your earlier questions around how do you create a culture of learning and sharing. Well, you have to create a space where everybody can contribute, and then you as learning professionals, as experts, have to be very accurate in that community, supporting people, telling people where they're getting things wrong, and working through the process. There's no guarantee that everything will be 100% accurate, but what you do get is a lot of contribution, and you can moderate. We did something very similar with graduates. Younger people have, I think, different expectations of learning. So we created an environment where they could share their videos, they could comment, they could find useful one-page guides to a great many things. And what we found is that this massively increased participation. We didn't have to force anybody to use this kind of an environment to learn, because really it was just a kind of a helpful environment, less of a learning environment, more of a, how do I do things in this organization. The other thing you can see here on the left is people were earning skill points. So we gamified the environment. I think somebody on this talk series is going to talk more about gamification, but we create an environment where you get badges and points, and there's a leaderboard, as you can see over here, for everything that you do. And people really appreciated that recognition that they were getting for the learning they were doing. We've also created similar content for leaders. This is from BP. BP is a global organization. It has leaders all around the world. And of course, it's very difficult to harmonize the approach. How, when you have 150,000 people operating in different countries all around the world, do you communicate a single best practice approach to leadership? Well, the answer was digital. We gave people really clear guidance. You can see a checklist here on the things that they should do when they become a leader. And again, this was very cheap to produce. It may look very polished, but actually anybody can produce a simple checklist. We produced a leadership phrase book. People were very confused about the language of leadership. So we produced a few pages which took jargon terms and demystified them. And then we communicated values and behaviors in a way that everybody could access. It didn't have to be e-learning modules, just simple guidance and short videos telling people, how to behave as a new leader. And we've been doing this for other organizations. And you can see in this case of a bank, this is all available on their mobile devices. So anybody who becomes a leader can understand how to have good conversations, short videos on things, and so on. And another example. So experiences. We talked a bit about, and I've shown you some examples of resources. I want to talk now a little bit about the other kinds of things that we can develop experiences. But first, a question for you. I know I'm conscious I've been talking quite a lot. My question is, what experiences in your time working for the Red Cross and Red Crescent have you learned the most from? What have been some of the most impactful experiences for you? Again, if you're happy to use the chat box. I'm just going to circle back to a question that Akash had, who says, in my factory, things not that good. The video would also broadcast mistakes. But here's the good thing. If the video broadcasts mistakes, everybody can see them. And you have an opportunity to say, no, that's not the right way. Here's a better way. And so it surfaces hidden mistakes. Quite often in the way people do things, mistakes become part of the culture. But in an environment where everybody can share what they're doing, those are much more visible, and it's a lot easier to correct them. Yeah, making mistakes. Yeah, Oliver says making mistakes is internal politics. Yeah, working directly with people. Yeah, difficult experiences which have been processed afterwards. Yeah, yeah. Yes, and Akash says, but then video would not necessarily be useful, which is exactly right, which is why sometimes you want to design an experience. And induction training content, yeah, learning by doing, absolutely, together in the forest. Stepping out of comfort zone, thanks Nicole, and being close to experienced volunteers, yeah. Trying too much, yep. Okay, so there's, I think, a common theme emerging in these experiences. Often it's an experience where you're learning by doing and often learning by failing. When you get a chance to try something, maybe with an experienced professional on hand to support you, and you try it out different ways and you learn what works and what doesn't. And this is a kind of a common story. So one of the critical things when we design workshop sessions is that we think about the experiential side, is that we design experiences where it's a safe environment to fail. We talk about experience design as being like a flight simulator. Because you build a flight simulator, obviously, because in the real world you don't want people to make that mistake. And so you build a way for them to actually practice things and make mistakes and to fail safely. So that's a great way to design experiences for people. And I'm going to give you an example from my own experience. When we worked at BP, we acquired a biofuels business where people were working in sugarcane fields in South America. So there was no question of e-learning modules. There was no question even of classroom training. But what happened is we had a small group of actors, 3 or 4 actors, who actually went to the site, and people stood around as they played out typical situations that leaders might encounter. And then people were invited to participate, to say where they thought things were going wrong, how they would have handled that situation. And again, it was a way of taking the experience to them. People enjoyed it, and it gave them a first-hand simulation of some of the challenges that you encounter as a leader in our world. So what kinds of experiences have we built? This was an experience, an 8-week experience we built for executive leaders in a big global organization. And they had to tackle things like public relations disasters, customer care, resource allocation. And so each of these was a challenge. And we would send them a video, give them a problem to work on, and the next day they would have to tell us how they were going to handle it, and they would get some feedback from experts. So a lot of this was digital. It didn't have to be very costly. We just thought of the challenges, and the challenges were modeled on real problems in the organization. And we would hand people a video and say, look, here's a customer complaining, or look, here is an extract from a social media post. How are you going to handle this? And they would have a day to think about it, come back with answers, and then we would give them feedback. So experience design, it's a great thing to do in a classroom, and it's also something that you can do digitally, but it's all about focusing on the challenges and presenting people with problems and giving them a chance to solve those problems. So finally, I'm going to talk about some of the low-cost areas as well. We've touched on cost as we've been talking, but I'm just going to focus in a little bit more on that question. So the first thing to think about is the secret to doing things at low cost is not about the technology or even about the budget. The secret is to start with your users, because any money that you spend will be wasted, I promise, if you haven't involved the users in the design of content. I understand that sometimes we need e-learning for compliance purposes, but to really shift performance and behaviors, we need to build good performance support. So when I talk about building helpful stuff or resources or performance support, this is a consequence of talking to people, using this process or a similar process to really discover what is it that people are struggling with, and then building helpful resources. Before I answer the next kind of question, I'd like to ask you, what sorts of technology do your target audience have in their hands? What kinds of devices do they have with them? If you could answer in the chat box, that would be great. Akash says, could we have some time for questions at the end? Absolutely. We will have plenty of time for questions. Yeah. Phones, Androids, mobile phones, laptops maybe, yeah. Smartphones, mail, WhatsApp, yeah, great. Mobile phones, yeah, varied. Yeah, some techies, some no tech at all, yeah. Smartphone, tablets, yeah. Yeah, it will vary. Not all have smartphones. We have also worked with organizations who have people working in parts of the world where they have smartphones. What they don't have is bandwidth because they have to pay. So they may have very limited, they may have a very sophisticated device, but limited kind of bandwidth. Internet not great in Wales. Yeah, that's Nicole, I know, yeah. Yeah. Actually, quite often 4G is better in parts of Africa than it is, I think, in the UK. So there's some themes there emerging with kind of smartphones. Our advice basically is often what we do with learning, which is a mistake, and I think somebody asked about common mistakes, is that we push a new technology on people. We say, you know, if you want to learn, you have to use this LMS system, or you have to use this format, or you have to use Flash modules. And actually, the best place to start is with the user, with the technology and with the applications that they're familiar with and that they are probably already using for learning, and then integrate into their workflow and into their conversation. So what does that mean in practice? Well, use the technology people are already using. Be mindful of questions like bandwidth. If you've done your audience research, you'll discover what the limitations are. So for example, producing long videos that are an hour long, it may work on a smartphone, but if people don't have the bandwidth, they won't watch it. So maybe checklists and guides that are very low bandwidth that people can print off. And of course, that's worth thinking about. Not everybody will have technology. If you created e-learning modules, that's already a big barrier because it requires often Flash, that people have to access an LMS, and so on. But if you create guides that people can print, well, then they can actually take them to a location where there is no technology, for example. That might be a checklist or a one-page guide. So what kinds of technology are people using? Well, you've already told me WhatsApp. Working with Fred, we set up the WhatsApp group, and I was just amazed at the amount of kind of conversation and sharing that started to happen. Of course, it raises questions about quality assurance and proper use and so on, but that's where you want to be, starting the conversation, you know, building a community and building a culture of sharing and learning, so that it is the joy of learning that people experience, not just the obligation. So WhatsApp is great. A number of people in the UK are talking about shifting to WhatsApp as a learning tool because it does allow you to share. One of the problems though with WhatsApp is it's a bit disorganized. If you've used it, you'll know it's all a kind of stream and good content disappears very quickly. Another technology that some organizations are using in place of an LMS is Slack. Slack is free. You can use it on a mobile device, and it allows you to create different channels. So you can have a channel which is just for content, a channel which is for chat, a channel which is for coaching or accessing experts, and it mixes up kind of content and conversation in a way which feels more natural to people. One downside to Slack is that many people haven't heard of it, and so unless you're involved in learning, you may well not know that it exists. Facebook, though, people have heard of. So many people, you can now set up Facebook groups. Those can be private, and those, again, can be really easy ways for people to access pictures and video. Again, pictures and video are really good where you have language barriers. If you're creating an e-learning module, then language and translation is a big cost and can be a big barrier. But if you're creating simply pictures of what to do, step by step, here are images, or a short video of how to do a complex procedure, that can cut across many of the language barriers. And it's also really easy and quick to produce and upload. Instagram, I think, is becoming very popular. Again, works really well with picture formats. A lot of the production technology, when I worked at the BBC, it was hugely expensive to produce video, and you need a whole film crew. And now we have the same quality technology in our hands. The main problem, though, is that smartphones produce good quality video, but terrible quality audio. So a very specific recommendation is, if you're going to start using smartphones to produce images, or more importantly, video, then get an external microphone. These things are very cheap. You can see here it's £11, about 15 euros maybe. And you can plug that in, attach it to somebody, and you can get somebody talking about a procedure or a story, or interview them very rapidly. And then you can share it using a variety of technologies. And finally, PowerPoint. People overlook the power of PowerPoint. It's great for producing checklists. You can format your slide to A4 in kind of portrait and produce content that people can access digitally or print off, and it can be used at the point of need. If you're about to do a difficult procedure, or you're tackling an emergency, you really don't necessarily want a 40-minute module or an hour-long video. What you want is some simple guidance that you can follow. This is used in the airline industry. In the airline industry, famously in the case of the Hudson River landing, the pilot used a checklist to tackle those problems. In the 60 seconds that he had to decide what to do, the way that he tackled that situation was to go through a checklist. So even in high-pressure emergency situations, checklists can be the best resource that people have. And finally, from a cost perspective, curate wherever you can. We often talk to organizations who are creating content about leadership advice and soft skills or emotional resilience, and this already exists. It may be on the TED site or YouTube. So if it's freely available, why not just kind of gather it together in a location which is accessible to your audience, because curation can save you an awful lot of time and money. So really the last slide, I guess, in this talk, and then I'd like to open it up to questions. This direction of travel, somebody asked about innovation, and I think we can begin to see these as very strong themes in the world of learning. Experience design, building these simulations or scenarios or stories, and gamification, and resources, performance support. These are definitely very emergent and kind of powerful themes. It does mean, though, a shift in our capability as learning professionals. Do we have the skills to create experiences which will build capability and impact people? Do we have the skills that we need, and the capabilities and the platforms that we need, and the tools to develop resources? Things you can see on the right-hand side: checklists, mistakes, guides, templates, top 10 tips, and so on. Do we know how to do these? Some of the capabilities that we've needed to do these kinds of things I've put in the middle here. So a shift in our skill set and the sorts of things that we know. So everything from tools like video production and graphic design through to kind of psychology and user-centered design. A good starting point, if you want to start down that track, is, as I say, Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, but also things like Don Norman's book. He's written a kind of really important book about user-centered design. So I'm going to stop there, because that brings me to the end, and then I'd like to open the conversation up for questions. And by all means, either use the voice or use chat if you prefer to ask your questions. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you found this valuable, and I welcome your questions. Thanks, Sonia.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Nick, for your presentation. So now we have the floor open to questions. You're welcome to post your question in the chat, or request the floor if you're connected by mic. Just let us know.
I'll go back to a question while you're thinking of or typing your questions about scenario. Are you talking about forum theatre techniques from Ikaterini? Yes, very similar to forum theatre techniques. Creating a a little bit like a role play. But what was different, and I think what was interesting about that example where we took the role play to the sugarcane fields, the biofuels sites, was this idea of creating kind of leadership dilemmas, critical points or mistakes that leaders might make, and then getting people to talk through or be involved or kind of participate in those outcomes, to try things out in a situation which socially felt quite real, and that was well liked, and it fitted in well. Is there Tony asks, is there a risk of information overload? Yes, there is, and people are coping with this by referencing rather than learning. It's a really important question, Tony, and what we're seeing is a shift away from a world where people hold all the information that they need in their heads to a world where they expect to look everything up as they go. And this is why I think it's so vital that we think about creating resources. We cannot assume that people will learn stuff and memorize stuff, especially if they're coming in and out of the organization with increasing speed. We have to assume that they will expect everything to be available as they need it, because that is the only way people can cope with information overload, to reference rather than learn. Akash says, I don't find any interest in working for a task that people don't find interesting. I'm interpreting your question a little bit, Akash, but quite often we find that people don't find things interesting. I'll give you a good one, data protection. Nobody seems to care very much about data protection, but the organization finds it very important. And so we have to create really quite compelling, impactful ways of getting across the importance of something like that. In your organization, it may be something different quality, but that's really quite challenging. How do we get across the importance of tasks that people don't find interesting? Martin's asked, how can humor be used safely to make the learning more engaging? That's a great question. And the answer is, it's a really tough thing to do, because humor is very different from one culture to another. And so whilst it can be used very powerfully because it has a strong emotional dimension, it has to be very carefully used, would be I think you probably know that already, Martin. Emotionally stimulating people, yeah. Charlie says yes. Humor is one form of emotional stimulation. Challenge is another. So scenarios and simulations can be very powerful because people, you feel it when you fail. And yeah, others are storytelling. Stories can be very powerful as well. When people talk about their experiences, sharing those stories can be very emotionally stimulating. Michael has asked, what kinds of experiences do you recommend for push type requirements? Yes, it has to be anything which is emotionally engaging, in essence. When we built simulators within BP, and these were multi-million pound simulators of real environments, I remember one of the instructors saying, you only know it's working when you feel it in your gut. So scenarios which don't feel real or which don't have any consequences are not good. We sometimes see that mistake made in learning design, where there are a number of scenarios presented and you select an outcome and you get an answer, that was wrong, or that was correct. What you need to know is, what is the consequence of that outcome? If you go through the traffic lights when they're red, there's a really big consequence for that, and so you don't do it again. If we create scenarios, we should always have that emotional outcome, otherwise people won't learn from it. What is asked in a training room often stays there, Martin says. Is anonymous questioning possible digitally? Yes, it is. As you will have seen from the WhatsApp group, those social environments often default to everything being very identifiable and very open. But you can set things up so that people are anonymous and they can ask questions anonymously. And some organizations have chosen to do that. Akash says, some organizations do not care to train people, but I'm responsible to train. Nobody cares. My role is to do things for which nobody cares. Yeah, but I would suggest that is often the situation we find ourselves in. And so the secret to solving that problem is to find out what they do care about. when you join an organization, you care about a whole bunch of things. You don't want to look stupid. You don't want to make big mistakes. You want people to respect you. But often the organization is pushing content which doesn't really help you with the stuff that you care about. But if you've understood, if you take the time to understand what people care about, then you can connect your content to their concerns. But that, you're absolutely right, Akash, that's a core problem. It's the Towards Maturity survey, which if you haven't seen it is a really interesting piece of research, shows that the number one reason why people don't do their learning is because they say they don't have time. They're too busy doing their job. But the number one reason they also give for why they would do learning is if it helps them with the job. In other words, people are saying that, look, you guys are producing all of this learning content, but it's not tailored to the things that I'm trying to do day to day. So really closing that gap is the secret to solving that problem, I would suggest, Akash. Not just pushing content at people, but understanding what we can do to support them. Charlie's answered. Any thoughts on providing evidence for compliance? Good question, Tony. So all of the things that we've created track usage. Obviously, working on safety at BP, we needed to create e-learning modules. And e-learning modules, I think, are still the best way. If you want to track completion for regulatory purposes, then yeah. There's lots of recording of learning in our model in terms of activities. So people get badges, obviously. In fact, there's a lot more recording of learning than there is in a traditional LMS. But there isn't the kind of completion record that you might want to show to a regulator. So in some cases, we've built systems which have performance support and e-learning. The e-learning doesn't change behavior very much, but from a legal perspective, you may be required to have it. The performance support doesn't give you a record of completion, but it really helps people to do the right things, for example, in a safety situation. So the two things can go hand in hand. What else? How to get people more involved. Nobody ever says they don't have time to Google or to YouTube. Maybe they do. But typically, if people don't have time to invest in learning, as Aliyah is suggesting there, it may well be because the learning, they don't see it as relevant to their role. Another reason may be that it's inaccessible. In other words, it's buried on some intranet system and it's really hard to find. So those two solutions, making it really relevant to people and making it really accessible, those are a good way to go. Yes, Dorcas is saying organizational learning is a huge challenge where information knowledge management is not prioritized. You're absolutely right. And this is a problem common to many organizations, and it gets worse as you get bigger, which is that knowledge is scattered all around the organization in formats which people can't access. What we found is most successful is creating these kinds of environments where people can contribute their knowledge, and some of it will be mistakes or incorrect, but at least then you can see it and you can moderate it and you can start to get people to share and participate in a conversation. As long as learning is a top-down thing where there's an authority that produces it, that problem seems to persist because there just isn't time to keep everything updated. Best ways to create or promote learning where you have very complex communication channels or approval processes. Yeah, sometimes people think you're entering the bypassing them. You're right. Shazad, that was a problem that we had again at BP. You can imagine that safety was a very heavily controlled and governed process, and we created an environment where everybody could talk about and share process safety advice and video. And initially, that meant working very closely with the safety team, who were very frightened about the content that people were producing. But what we found is that over time, their fears of this new way of doing things, of encouraging people to share and skipping approval processes or governance, those fears could be controlled and alleviated. We had a quick 24-hour moderation turnaround period, and in fact, people weren't doing as many wrong things as we thought. In fact, they were doing very many more good things, so they were discovering better new ways of doing things. Motivate. How can you motivate yourself? One of the things I think gamification badges and points for new generations, I think, seems to be quite a big motivator. So the organization, of course, wants tracking and records of completion. But what does the individual get from that? Well, certificates and badges and points are really good ways of giving people digital motivation for the things that they're doing. And this is called gamification, of course. What else do we have? Making videos in local language. One more question. Link to Facebook. Sharing it, yeah, it's very difficult. We spent a long time with a big organization trying to talk to them about how to get people to share. And it's a very funny thing that you mentioned with that question. This is from Helena. That people were very, very happy to share in their social media, in their personal lives, but not so much in the organization. And that's because there's only a downside to sharing in the organization. That if you get it wrong, if you share something and you get it wrong, there can be big negative consequences. So people are very afraid. They're very visible. And so generally people don't share in organizations. So creating a safe environment where people are actively rewarded for participating, where there's a lot of freedom, where it's also social. You know, when you go to a party, you don't just talk about work. You also need to have a social environment which is fun, where people are sharing what they're doing and a little bit of their local lives. And we did a lot of work, Charlie and I, on that precise challenge within BP. And we found that making the social media environments really social is a big part of the way to solve that. I can see
well, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick. Sorry, unfortunately, even though it's very interesting and there have been lots of questions, we need to end the webinar, but we want to invite everyone to continue the discussions on the Facebook group. We have posted the link in the chat, and we will be sending you a link, an email with a link to the Facebook group afterwards. So I want to give you thank you to you and Charlie for presenting today this excellent webinar, and I will give the floor to Fred just for one remark.
Thank you very much. I mean, Nick and Charlie, you know, we've really enjoyed the session today and previous sessions on the WhatsApp. Just reiterating what Margarita says, I think it's been very interesting, a lot of interesting questions. Please, everybody, do go to the Facebook group. I hope Nick and Charlie, you're happy to continue some of the discussion there in amongst all the other work that you have to focus on too, of course. But and I think we all moved on a little bit today, and let's hope that we continue to do so with your help and guidance too. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks, everyone.